So in these next two chapters from Jason De Leon's book, we're going into greater detail into issues of border violence in terms of structural violence, and the ways in which land is weaponized by immigration policy in order to enact violence not only on the living, but also on the bodies of the dead. But let's start off with a big honkin' content warning, because we're going to be talking about state and border violence, sexual assault, graphic descriptions of death and decomposition. This is, as you have realized, a very graphic book. And if something in the book triggers previous trauma, you are totally welcome to step away from it. Step away from the class, step away from the book, process that, distract yourself, whatever you need to do, and come back to it if you are able. Or alternatively, I guess not. So in chapter 2, what Jason De Leon does in this chapter is he articulates a narrative that gives you flesh and a sense of the immediate experience of migrants crossing the border. And to do this, he draws on hundreds of interviews that he's had with undocumented migrants. And this is a practice that he describes as semi-fictionalized ethnography. What he means by that is that the story he presents isn't a thing that really happened. It's instead a narrative that he wrote based on hundreds of interviews, based on pulling together details and patterns from this broad range of interviews and pulling them together into a single story. So this story didn't happen to any one person, but rather it helps illustrate the patterns that Jason De Leon was able to learn about through talking with migrants. And the way he sets this chapter up, right, is he goes back to this point from earlier sections in which he says the federal government sanitizes border violence through a variety of kinds of language games. And he talks about this as a kind of semantic cloak, right? When we talk about things like prevention through deterrence. He makes this point, prevention through deterrence looks good in a PowerPoint. It sounds good on government documents. And what it hides is the visceral violence and death of border violence and policing. And so this is really where this chapter starts, right? What is hidden within the shadow of this kind of sanitized language of deterrence and hostile terrain? And here I've given you this longer quote that I pulled from in the last slide, right, in which he really unpacks what he means by this question. What hides in the shadow of this sanitized language? And so he says, what hides in the shadows of quote-unquote hostile terrain, flesh-roasting temperatures, steel walls and remote ground sensors, thousands of heavily armed agents on the ground? What about the venomous snake bites or bandits with a propensity for gang rape? Shoes that break apart after staggering in them for miles over lonely mountains. An undiagnosed heart condition exacerbated by days in the desert. Although all of these things and others have become incorporated into the Border Patrol's system of enforcement, none of these realities are captured by policy rhetoric. But the deployment of the word deterrence is not just a political magic trick used to mask the human impact in this strategy. And really what Jason De Leon is trying to do in this chapter is articulated on page 43. And he says, the prevention through deterrence strategy has created a setting in which the Border Patrol can draw on the agency of animals and other non-humans to do its dirty work, while simultaneously absolving itself of any blame connected to migrant injuries or the loss of life. So he's interested in how does border enforcement draw on the desert as a resource that can be mobilized in order to distribute death, in order to enact anti-immigration policies and violence against undocumented migrants. while at the same time being able to claim that it's not policy, it's not the government that's enacting these kinds of violences, it's the quote-unquote natural environment. So it's a double kind of work of, on the one hand, enacting people, subjecting people to systematic death, while at the same time absolving blame for those extremely violent policies. And his goal with this chapter, right, is to use an ethnographic approach in order to foreground the experiences of migrants themselves, basically taking what he had critiqued before as a kind of sanitized language that lacks any kind of graphic reality, and showing what that graphic reality is. What is the graphic reality of violence and suffering that is underneath this sanitized language of federal policy? And in order to understand how this kind of structural violence operates, he draws on this concept of the hybrid collectif. Now, this is an idea that's meant to challenge the kinds of nature, culture, human, non-human binaries that we were critiquing a couple weeks ago, or last week. And the idea is to rethink what we mean by agency. So let me start by talking about a little bit about what agency is. When we talk about agency in anthropology, we usually are talking about a relationship between agency and structure. Now, this is a way of thinking about how humans operate and make choices in strategic ways in social systems that really moves away from kinds of the limitations of US-centric ideologies of things like freedom and choice. So agency always happens within a structure, right? You can think of an example of this is when you choose courses each semester, you go through a list of courses offered by the university, and you select the ones you want to take, right? So you have agency to choose what classes you want, but within the existing larger institutional structure of what's being offered that year and the structure of the university itself. There's classes you can't take because they're not being offered. Maybe they're being offered another semester, maybe they'll never be offered. So structure and agency is really a way of thinking about how do people strategically and intentionally navigate social systems. And thinking about the ways structures constrain our movement, not only in the sense of limiting our movement, but also make certain kinds of movement possible. You may not be able to take certain classes, but you can learn about certain other things, right? So structure, it does both, right? It makes certain things possible, and in doing so, it makes other things impossible or more difficult. So anyway, right, coming back to the thinking about agency, what hybrid collectif does is it makes us think about agency as not just a function of an individual decision maker or an individual rational human being. And the idea is that agency always happens in relation. It doesn't happen to isolated individuals. It's not a function of a kind of disembodied human mind. Rather, as I've been saying, it emerges in these relationships that include human and non-human actants. And by actants, he means a source of action. So when I say agency emerges in relationship, here's kind of an example of what I mean, right? You are learning about this idea of hybrid collectif right now. To do that, you're listening to me speaking on a PowerPoint slide on your computer, which I've recorded on my computer many miles away from you. And so it's actually the ways in which the computer and the technology of PowerPoint allows us to do and interact in certain ways and do kinds of things, right? That structure what we can do. Maybe you take this idea from this class of structural violence and, that changes the way you live your life in some way, or it helps you live your life the way you want to in some way. I don't know. I'm being idealistic. I'm just trying to give an example, right? And so we have to understand these broader relationships and systems. So my agency to teach you this material is premised on the PowerPoint, which is premised also on my material computer. Of course, the computer, as we've been talking about, is also premised on things like global exchange networks in which sweatshops in China are used to create iMacs or whatever the fuck this is, an iBook Pro, whatever the fuck I'm on. using things like lithium batteries that are obtained through Bolivia as a result of like fascist coups that make these resources more available and thus more cheap. Thankfully, Bolivia is really turning that shit around right now. But anyway, basically the point I'm making, right, is my agency to do anything is always premised on my relationships with human and non-human beings. It's premised on my relationships with y'all as students, with the computer, with lithium mines in Bolivia. And when he talks about actants, right, his argument here is an actant is kind of a way of talking about an actor. But whereas an actor, we might think of like an actor within the border policies, or we can talk about migrants as actors. The term actant is similar, but basically is meant to include non-human beings who might not necessarily be acting in an intentional way, but nevertheless are acting on people. The desert acts on people. And so, essentially, to kind of come back to the full big picture, what Jason De Leon is doing here is he's trying to talk about the ways in which border policies and border violence operates through a web of human relationships, in which we have to understand agency as not simply a function of the human mind, but rather complex webs between human and non-human actors, between human policy and the desert. Now, the rest of the chapter, right, is devoted to telling this story that he synthesizes from interviews with hundreds of folks, right? And I'm not going to cover that in detail, but I think one question we might talk about, right, is what do you guys make of this strategy of storytelling as well as semi-fictionalized ethnography? What's that useful for? What are its limitations? Chapter 3 then moves to the question of how violence is enacted upon corpses. And specifically, it uses a forensic anthropology approach. Essentially, forensic anthropology is a branch of bioanthropology. It's often it's basically the study of the decomposition process or the body after death. A lot of forensic anthropologists go into police work, right, where they basically work to identify, they study the body to identify, for example, the causes of murder in murder, homicide cases. So basically he's asking, how can this approach of forensic anthropology within bioanthropology, how does that help us make border violence more visible? And in this chapter, he has an experiment where he kills pigs and lets them decompose in the desert and documents what that process is like. And in order to better understand what happens to human bodies of migrants who die on the trail. And the overarching question here, right, is on the one hand this first question, how does forensic anthropology, as well as a multi-species approach, help us make border violence visible? And then also, how does the U.S. border policy mobilize the desert to enact violence upon corpses? How are corpses themselves targeted for state violence? Now many students struggle with this chapter because the question that I've encountered from students in Virginia, right, is the sense that like the experiment with pigs is just unnecessary. Now that's a question y'all can talk about more in the discussion board if y'all like. Is this unnecessary? Or does this approach really teach us something useful or important about state violence, about structural violence? And of course, Jason De Leon himself is very conflicted about the process of trying to study violence enacted against people who are dehumanized by enacting violence on non-human others. And that's a real struggle point for him, and I do appreciate that he makes these struggles explicit in his book and talks through them, and doesn't necessarily try to sweep them under the rug. And the concept that comes out of the two concepts that come out of this work, right, are necropolitics and necroviolence. Now these are two separate things, right? Necropolitics is a concept that we talked about a little bit last week, And here are some quotes taken from the book to really explain what it is, right? But necropolitics has to do with the question of who is targeted for death and who is made to live. Who is killable in the eyes of the state? And what are the kinds of larger legal and social structures that make certain bodies killable while others are not killable? You know, what's the difference between an unfortunate death on a migrant trail or police brutality in which a cop kills someone versus a murder in the legal sense, right? And this is, of course, the struggle that happens in legal courts all the time, right? When, in terms of police brutality, is this murder in a legal sense, right? And as such, does it come with the kinds of punishments usually associated with murder? Or alternatively, is the victim, already killable enough such that this no longer qualifies, according to the state, as being quote-unquote murder? And so the way Jason DeLeon talks about necropolitics, right, is it's killing in the name of sovereignty, killing in the name of the state. It's about the tangibles of life and death, a suspected terrorist who disappears forever in the bowels of Guantanamo Bay, a drone strike in Yemen intended to kill al-Qaeda fighters that ends up vaporizing members of a wedding procession, a 15-year-old walking down a street in Mexico who was shot in the back 8 times by Border Patrol standing on the U.S. side because they thought he was throwing rocks at them. Now, one of the big theorists who explain and coin this idea of necropolitics is Akile Membe, who says that necropolitics is the ultimate expression of sovereignty, or that necropolitics is, as the ultimate expression of sovereignty, something that relies to a large degree in the power and capacity to dictate who must live and who must die. And this is really articulating what necropolitics is about. We're looking at the ways in which governments and legal and social systems organize who is killable, who must die, and who can live in really systematic ways. We're talking about the systematic ways in which states distribute death. Now, when Jason DeLeon coins this other concept of necroviolence, he is actually talking about something subtly different from necropolitics. Whereas necropolitics has to do with how states organize this distribution of death, what Jason DeLeon is trying to get at with this idea of necroviolence is the ways in which the corpse is targeted for violence according to these kinds of political projects. So necroviolence is violence enacted against the corpse. And as Jason DeLeon points out, this kind of violence can have many different kinds of functions. You can desecrate the body as a way of enacting violence against the spirit or the soul or the afterlife. For example, there was an example I want to say from Iraq, but maybe I'm misremembering it, of a U.S. soldier who talks about peeing on the corpses of slain opponents, right? And peeing on them, and part of what they say, right, is this idea that because they've touched an infidel in this way and they've been desecrated, they can no longer go to Mecca, right? So it's a kind of spiritual warfare. Another example of this is in Jamaica, right? In the slave plantation era, one of the issues that slave owners were really struggling with in Jamaica was that enslaved people kept committing suicide, because that was better than working in the sugar plantations. And the idea was that when you died, your soul would travel back to your hometown in Africa. And so slave owners and the Jamaican colonial government ended up having to develop an entire set of policies of spiritual warfare in order to prevent enslaved people from killing themselves and cooperate in this colonial project of staying alive so that they could continue laboring. And one of the ways that was done was by desecrating and essentially torturing corpses in order to kind of demonstrate that the slave owners had this kind of total power over enslaved people that extended not just through life but also into death. Another kind of function that this kind of violence can have is to mutilate the body, to send a message to the living. That one's pretty straightforward, like you put a head on a pike and it's fucking terrifying. The third function of necroviolence is the complete destruction of the corpse. And this does two things. On the one hand, it can make it impossible to properly bury the dead. It can interrupt mourning processes because the dead may simply just be disappeared, whether the government disappears you or whether you have disappeared along the migrant trail, right? Which leaves your loved ones with no sense of closure, no knowledge of whether you're really still alive or dead. And of course, in Catholic traditions, being able to bury the corpse is an important aspect of burial that includes, there's a significant spiritual dimension to that, right? So when the corpse is completely destroyed, all of these things become impossible. And that inflicts its own form of spiritual as well as emotional violence against the living and the dead. Meanwhile, when there's no corpse, there's also no evidence. There's no, which is a dynamic that lets perpetrators claim plausible deniability, that they're not really responsible because maybe there's no evidence, there's no forensic evidence, for example, that can be investigated in a court of law, or the Border Control can say, oh, it's not our policies, it's not the Border Patrol that's enacting these forms of violence, it's nature, it's the desert. And through this kind of logic, right, one of Jason DeLeon's points, again, is that the state manages to outsource violence to the desert to keep its hands clean while achieving the same effect, which is the systematic distribution of death. Now, I haven't gone into the really graphic descriptions of the migrant trail or the graphic descriptions of rotting pigs' corpses, but those are things that I'm happy for y'all to go into, and I would encourage you in your discussion to pull out these kinds of ethnographic details and run with them. I've mostly focused on giving you the broad conceptual overview of the chapter, and I think that would be a useful exercise and a useful use of your time. But meanwhile, here are several discussion questions that I've given you. If structure will be helpful, if you want to go in a different direction, go with it.